Disclaimer: this video was made in September 2025, while Death Stranding 2 is currently being enjoyed by millions of gamers worldwide. However, I am not one of them, and won't be for a while, and I am perfectly fine with that. It is exclusive to a platform I'm not interested in. I'll pick it up in a year if it comes out on PC or something, and if not, I'll reconsider in 2 years or something. I have no problems with being a patient gamer. So the frame of reference for this video is going to be limited to just the stuff that happens in Death Stranding 1. And I am perfectly happy with that. I just enjoyed a replay of the game alongside a bunch of Metal Gears. I have absolutely devolved from a Metal Gear Solid fanboy into an actual genius Kojimbo sycophant who is ready to argue that Hideo Kojima is the Homer of video games. Being a Kojima fan is really fun right now. The review scores are high, vibes are good, apparently he's in overcorrecting crowd-pleasing mode, and we've technically got 2 Kojima crowd-pleaser games coming out on the same year, 20 years after what I thought was his peak. Everyone's learning how to fall in love with this artsy-fartsy, pretentious weirdo, even Bo Burnham.
Alright, I'm into this. Yeah, it's giving me sort of like Death Stranding vibes, you know? Because it's like, it's fucking boring. But that's like the point, I think.
He's right, that is the point. The people are finally getting it. This game, and a lot of Kojima's new style, is about having fun with pointing out ironies of how and why humans enjoy art and entertainment, and also about very precisely identifying the exact links in the chain of artistic inspiration that gives all of us new experiences and new ideas. In the interest of helping everyone not only understand Death Stranding better, but also understand everything better, I've put together a reading list of some of these precise links in the game's inspirational chain. Thank God I finally got around to reading these. How did it take me so long to read? Whoa, I bet you didn't expect that one, huh? But I bet it makes a lot of sense after like a millisecond of thought, right? Waiting for Godot was a groundbreaking play back in 1952 for establishing what existential absurdity would look like in the secular, postmodern, post-nuclear, post-World War II era that has consistently felt bizarre and strange and stupid to be living through for about 80 years now. This play directly inspired so many genres and styles of modern art and entertainment that it's pretty hard to gauge exactly how. And I'm kind of ashamed it took me this long to finally get around to reading through it alongside the 2001 Barry McGovern production currently available free on YouTube. Waiting for Godot is arguably the birth of modern absurdist theater, the popularizer of modern post-apocalyptic genre settings, and it basically is what set the primary flavor profile for most modern post-apocalyptic absurdism or surrealism, which are the genres Death Stranding's inside of. In a nutshell, Waiting for Godot, actually I should have been saying Godot this whole time. In a nutshell, Waiting for Godot, I actually mean Godot, is a minimalist stage play about 2 disillusioned men who pass the time waiting in a trashy, barren, presumably post-apocalyptic wasteland for a man named Godot, Godot, who never comes. I really need to be saying Godot. We all need to be saying Godot. It was never supposed to be subtle that the man's name was supposed to sound like God, and that the closest thing to a moral the story has is that it's silly to try and find traditional, reliable meanings within the absurdities of what the world has come to. Godot does not just represent God, but Godot could also represent happiness, or normalcy, or stability, or society. But despite how tragic that sounds, the play is also a comedy. It's very, very funny, despite the tragic apocalypticism, which establishes that one of the conventions of post-apocalyptic media we so often see is a kind of grungy comic irony associated with the setting. I mean, Death Stranding's definitely got a sense of humor. Slapstick comedy is built into the control scheme. Half the buttons on the controller are about making sure your character doesn't slip and tumble. It's a kind of parody of conventional third-person action game controls, similar to how Waiting for Godot's action, which is almost entirely just 2 fast-talking actors impressively delivering lines and wit, makes the play a parody of drama itself. So Waiting for Godot being a play about absurdity means that the play was a kind of satire of plays themselves, as if the writer was having fun challenging himself with minimalism, of seeing just how many laughs and tears can come from a small theater set made out of trash, worked by mostly just 2 actors. Well, sometimes there's 3 or 4, but a lot of this avant-garde Samuel Beckett minimalism stuff was really just jokes about how cheaply they could manage to pay actors and run a show. the excessive lack of traditional theatrical action makes fun of its own format. It is always described as if the whole play is just two guys who don't do anything. They just wait around all day for a couple days for Godot. And yet you still will laugh, you will still gasp, you will still feel something deep in your soul for them that you'll relate to your own problems too. You will still be sufficiently entertained, but this marketing of saying that it's about nothing still persists to this day. Broadway is currently advertising a production starring Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter. It's gonna be Bill and Ted's excellent Godot, waiting anti-adventure.
The greatest play ever written about nothing. Well, nothing and everything, but mostly nothing. Seriously, nothing happens.
Of course things happen. That's only about as true as saying Seinfeld is a show about nothing. It's an absurd statement for an absurd play that is aware that it is absurd, and it is deliberately asking for highly personal, stretchy interpretations. It's popular for not having an immediately discernible moral of the story. Whatever personally fulfilling future you are waiting for yourself, that is your Godot. Also, like Death Stranding, it angered its first wave of viewers. The first audiences in French theaters were usually put off by how weird it was, until it performed in a German prison to much greater appreciation. A year or so later, Beckett struck a deal to produce the play for an audience of American prisoners at San Quentin who ended up loving it, and that really got the ball rolling towards popularizing it on a worldwide scale. It's unexpected, but it does make sense that prisoners would be the first kind of audience to fully appreciate it, probably because they had been spending years and years waiting for their own Godot. Theater buffs rebuffed it at first. It was prisoners, of all kinds of people, who helped theater buffs figure out avant-garde, absurd, minimalist art. So just like Death Stranding, it only became popular after, and actually maybe even because, it angered that first wave of audience members who were seeing it in a more traditional building and expecting a more traditional play. Now, to compare this directly to Death Stranding, I want to say that when I was a kid in the new millennium, a lot of games, marketing, and media wanted to compare video games with movies. That attitude is still going to be around marketing departments and trash comments, but nowadays, 20 years later, it's feeling like the closer metaphor to compare video games to would be something like theater or performance art, because of the interactivity and the unpredictability. And you can see that progression reflected in Kojima's own games going from Metal Gear Solid to Death Stranding. Metal Gear Solid is cinematic, it's a linear narrative that you could potentially edit into a 90-minute movie-like video if you really wanted to, and it would still entertain. But I don't think you could get that same kind of entertainment out of a cinematic edit of some of the later Kojima games like MGS5 and Death Stranding. The linearity of their narrative stories is not traditional. The way they break away from the ancient Greek norms of classical story structures is not traditional. And furthermore, for Death Stranding, the action on the screen doesn't even look that traditionally exciting because the real action is happening off-screen by your fingers on the controller. It is difficult to show off what's cool about the game in trailers and videos. Just way too much of the audience's thoughts about their own performance is required to feel the moods and themes and thoughts the game wants you to get. In other words, for games, telling a story mechanically does absolutely not mean the same thing as telling a story verbally or visually, and Death Stranding is so interested in exploring the maximalism of its movement mechanics that a satisfying visual representation of playing the game should show what your fingers are doing on the controller. Otherwise, it's just going to look like a guy walking, which really pissed off a lot of the early audience. Just like how Waiting for Godot criticizes the concepts of traditional action in plays to having guys just stand around and wait all day, Death Stranding criticizes the traditional concepts of video game action. Violence. Instead, you just walk around all day. There's an extremely small amount of human-killing, human violence action, but a truly excessive amount, an egregious obsession with exploring human versus nature violence action that doesn't easily appeal to the usual audiences despite actually activating a lot of the same moods, hitting a lot of the same beats and rhythms, and ultimately emotional payoffs of satisfying the same psychological impulses that tell compelling, meaningful stories. And, They're both also really interested in ropes. Both Death Stranding and Waiting for Godot love representing some kind of metaphorical social bond by rope. In Godot, it's pretty negative, representing bondage and slavery. In Death Stranding, it's a bit more complicated, but generally leans towards more positive social connections. But yeah, I'll get deeper into this later, but they both have a visibly big interest in rope metaphors. So anyways, comparing Death Stranding's moment of being a AAA big-budget overproduced video game that ended up getting into absurd avant-garde territory with theater doing something similar because of Waiting for Godot does seem very appropriate. Not only are both post-apocalyptic dramas about deconstructing human society and the clean slate of a wasteland, not only are both works about exploiting the sparse human connections of that wasteland world to talk about Sisyphean existentialism, not only are both unexpectedly more funny than you would expect all this tragic subject matter to hit you with, but the easiest thing that can be said of both is that both are definitive examples of their medium's developing absurdism. Both of them had some kind of ambition about getting some kind of absurdism movement going. And absurdism kinda requires a few decades of established conventions to settle themselves in order for the absurd to even look absurd. To that point, Death Stranding itself might not have even seemed as absurd if it came out 20 years earlier in 1999 when the 3D action game conventions hadn't been settled in yet, but in 2019 it was. And in 2019, it could be a game about making fun of what had become conventional. It could be about playing with those conventions, about having fun with those conventions and making fun of those conventions. It could look superficially boring at first glance, and that could be the point, because in so many wonderful subtle little ways, Death Stranding is a game about exploring the absurdity of the activity of playing games. Whoa, I bet you did expect that one, huh? Homo Ludens' concepts are explicitly all over Death Stranding 1 and the branding of Kojima's own studio. In the game, Heartman talks all about the Homo Ludens concept, and in interviews, Kojima and Shinkawa have basically parroted language from the Homo Ludens book almost verbatim. Ironically, I couldn't find any quotes of them saying they actually read it or that they made their employees read it, but I think we can safely assume for now that they did, and that it may actually be the most directly influential book on this game out of the whole list. In any case, Homo Ludens, a study of the play element and culture by Johann Huizinga, is considered to be a part of a kind of canon on game academia, and I am also ashamed of how many years I've been doing this without reading this book. It's old, it's really old, it's from 1938, it's super Eurocentric and colonialist and pre-World War II, and there's about 90 years of electricity, video, audio, and narrative design history that is now associated with games that the author could not have possibly acknowledged. Its understanding of games, and also people, is very different from ours nowadays, but the thesis is surprisingly still applicable, and in a wonderful way, it really does make Death Stranding make a whole lot more sense. For 320 pages, the author argues that human nature can be defined by the unique way humans play, compared to how other animals play. The thesis is that play is certainly not unique to humans, but that games are. It's that the profoundly more complicated and impressive abilities of humans come from a combination of our unique spoken language abilities with something that is not unique and instinctive to many, many other animals.
Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy?
The author defines play as a lot of things pretty broadly. For all animals, including humans, play is a discharge of energy, a restorer of energy, a satisfier of imitative instincts, a way to satisfy a need for relaxation, a way to teach restraint, a way to practice or simulate activities before doing them for real later, a safe outlet for harmful impulses, or fictions designed to keep up feelings of personal value. And while most animal play ticks most of those boxes, human play is uniquely poised to combine with spoken language to become the catalyst of all uniquely human activities ever. If the ability to do spoken language really is the big defining line between humans and animals, then all of human culture is the natural result of humanity's natural play instincts combining with our naturally evolved spoken language instincts. He's saying that playing, to some extent, is required to be able to use your imagination and turn what you're thinking about into words. In other words, play is an activity that explicitly draws a line between make-believe and reality. An abstract human thought makes that line blurry. So humans did not invent play, but did invent games. And the also pretty broad definition of games that he's working with requires the following elements. Certain limits of time or space, with the participants acting out the play in a visible order, according to rules freely accepted by both parties, outside the realm of necessity or rationality. A core defining feature of play is that you don't immediately need it to survive like you do immediately need food, water, and shelter. So supposedly, as the Homo Ludens version of the evolutionary narrative goes, as our prehistoric ape-like hominid ancestors evolved their language abilities, the concept of play would gradually evolve into games. Those hard limits mentioned by the game definition 3 sentences ago would have been applied to instinctive impulses, and games make for a kind of restrained outlet of those impulses. So a lot of the activities early humans would have considered fun, playful games would have gradually become very serious, very boring, very not fun institutions of human civilization. So play has got to be deeply important to the human experience. It's just got to be. Just look at how it is the primary driver of human behavior for so many years of a child's development. Running around and playing is like the most important thing, the most important desire for most children whose other immediate survival needs have been met. The author also thinks that the word play, in whatever language you first learn it in, is one of the most important words that humans ever invented. He's a linguist who spends the first chunk of this book just going down a huge list of diverse human languages from all over the planet, east and west, north and south, that all seem to have the same definition and even similar etymological traditions for using the word play. In all these languages, it's the root word for countless other words in the languages. You can barely think at all with words in your head without hitting some kind of word that refers to play. The author is also insistent on the requirement of a so-called agonic element to play in games, how a bit of agony or suffering tends to be associated with this activity and how it is supposed to lead to some kind of greater good. In the animal world, animals will go a great deal out of their way to compete in mating dances and nest decorations and all sorts of rituals where they will beat themselves up or beat each other up to raise the next generation of animals. And in the human world, a good game, in the way the author would have understood it in the 1930s, is supposed to be a satisfying, interesting challenge, right? We kind of still are stuck there. Games are still simulated conflicts. Whether it's pretending to kill people with horrible violence or pretending to just steal a dog's toy, there's an ever-present element of simulated suffering or some implied narrative of suffering being overcome, as if games are a universal human narrative about overcoming suffering for the betterment of the greater good. And so, very, very slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years of prehistory, playing with sticks and rocks gradually turns into constructing shelter. Playing with grunts and moans and guttural mouth sounds gradually became spoken language. Playing with words and riddles and abstractions gradually became religion and philosophy. I think we have all dreamed up of some kind of prehistoric narrative of small, game-like, competitive tribal rivalries gradually evolving into huge, horrible war. And likewise, as war gradually got more and more horrible, humans have tried to apply limits to them. Rules of engagement, war crimes, evolution from medieval chivalry to modern nuclear disarmament treaties. In other words, the very real, very serious rules of warfare that colonels and generals so often describe as being like a game. And sure, there's gonna be annoying arguments of semantic minutiae here and anywhere, but I think the core thesis here is very difficult to argue against. I was reading a different book a couple years ago about a completely different topic that described a lot of the same evolutionary narrative in a lot of the same terms. It was about civilization arising from small towns engaging in play farming, before big city-states in the Fertile Crescent escalated that small-scale play farming concept into large-scale agriculture to invent city-states. This idea of large-scale human achievements, beginning with playfulness and games, does really seem to have me convinced. For now, at least. The author even makes the case that legal matters, that our current understanding of the law, gradually developed from considerably more playful legal practices in Greek history before Roman history in the 1st century BC put a downer on previously playful courtroom atmospheres ever since. But even today, the lawyers and judges who work at court tend to have a lot more of a sense of humor about the situation than the common folk who are there because they're in trouble. But hey, notice how court simultaneously also refers to places where people go to play games, where people act out little mock competitions between themselves? After all, a lawsuit being argued in a courtroom fits his definition of playing a game. There's a limited space and time where lawsuits are argued. The participants take their turns in a visible order, according to rules consensually accepted by the competitors, outside the sphere of necessity or rationality in the sense that courtroom proceedings are full of superfluous, playful pageantry of purple prose, and there's legal Latin, there's ancient robes, there's powdered wigs, all of which are not actually necessary and certainly not rational. So, from this author's angle, from his definition, the law is like a game. War is like a game. Building a house is like playing a game. Marriage is like a game where you win the affection of your spouse and then endure several decades of agonic trials for the greater good. Learning a language is like playing a game. Human children learn how to be human by learning how to play games. Here's a quote from the author himself. "We might, in a purely formal sense, call all of society a game." I love it. I love it. So if playing a game is an activity that occurs within certain limits of time and space in a prescribed or visible order according to rules freely accepted outside the sphere of necessity or rationality, then that is a definition so broad that almost everything can be thought of as like a game. So long as you can get a bit stretchy with number 4, you can get stretchy with the whole thing. Right here on page 116, he says the ultimate conclusion of this line of thinking. The entire universe is like a game. After all, the current science is saying it's not infinite, so the furthest possible limits of all time and space ever would count as the game space. The court where the game of all existence is being played. The mechanical interactions between atoms, where atoms are shaking and smashing and splitting to form together all of material reality, is what counts as the participants acting in a prescribed logical order. From that perspective, anything can seem agonic, limited, logical, and therefore game-like. And I don't actually think this is reductive. The author is not out to prove that the universe is actually, objectively, by non-human universal scientific standards, like a game. It's more about the effectiveness of the argument, about how hard it is for human thoughts to break out of that game metaphor when we are thinking with words in our heads. It's 300 plus pages about how easy it is to argue that anything is like a game because it is so difficult to narrowly define the word game in the first place. And that maybe the reason for that is because of human nature itself, that this kind of philosophical conclusion is what would quite naturally happen to an advanced enough mammalian primate animal that evolves the ability to make a complicated spoken language. So during some moment during the thousands upon thousands of years of prehistoric evolution, when our early ancestors, the first ones who were actually able to talk about their playful instincts for the first time, that was the moment that sparked all of human civilization afterwards. Perhaps this even happened before humanity began. And that's probably crazy. The real story is probably a hell of a lot more complicated than that, but imagining some version of human evolution looking like the natural universe learning how to play its own games is a way of describing human life that I find pretty convincing and satisfying for now. Especially useful for doing game criticism or thinking about how many real-life problems we could potentially turn into interesting games. Underneath all the philosophical redundancy is a simple thesis, that the concept represented by the word game in so many languages, not just English, is so omnipresent in human thought because thinking of any problem at all as if it's like a game is part of human nature. So, after all that, Death Stranding does indeed make a lot more sense. In fact, it's glaringly obvious now. In 2015, Kojima said that, "Even if the Earth were stripped of life and reduced to a barren wasteland, our imagination and desire to create would survive. Beyond survival, it would provide hope that flowers may one day bloom again." This quote came out before Death Stranding was revealed, but with retrospect, it is clear he is talking about the Homo Ludens themes of the game he was about to reveal. He's not talking about the surface story about bridges and mommy issues and Corellium and all that nonsense, but rather the narrative design that the game was going to be about teaching players a lesson about play. Through the invention of play, our new evolution awaits, is the Koji Pro mission statement, and also a nice parallel with the playful slapstick humor Sam Porter Bridges brings to his world's apocalyptic problems. Even though for a lot of screen time the game looks pretty grisly and scary, one of the points of the Homo Ludens book was exactly that, exactly about how agonizing or agonic a meaningful play session can be. So there's an incredible sense of self-reflection to this game's experience that I think goes even beyond self-awareness. Because in so many ways, Death Stranding is a commentary on what it means to play a video game as a human pastime that adult humans do with our free time to relax when we're not working. It makes an exciting science fiction adventure out of an unremarkable job of manual labor. It's a playful exploration of the incredibly mundane act of walking. It is playing with your expectations of what happens when you tilt an analog stick forward to make a character walk through 3D space. You know, like in Mario. It's a heroic satire of delivery jobs where the game is all about making a walk from point A to B as playfully meaningful as possible. It's also unapologetically expressive of an individual human person's unique headspace. An important part of the experience is spotting all the autorial influences, recognizing all the Kojima-isms going on that his games just cannot seem to escape from no matter the decade. So, Death Stranding is a famous video game designer humorously, playfully reflecting on what everyone else was considering good game design for most of his career, and how he himself played a part in shaping a lot of those tastes. Kojima's famous for adding actually good storytelling and meaningful messages to something that plays like the arcadey time-killer quarter-muncher Pac-Man. So, 20 years later after Metal Gear Solid, Death Stranding is also kinda asking whether or not humans ended up playing games to express meaningful messages of human culture like Metal Gear Solid was doing. Or whether or not games are still like Pac-Man, just a way for humans to kill time and spend money when we're not working a mundane, boring job. It's a commentary on why people play games, and whether or not they can be used to tell a more meaningful human truth about the human condition. Death Stranding humorously contrasts its lack of human-on-human violence with conventional video game design by attempting to satisfy many of the same psychological urges with deliberately unconventional solutions. Obstacles are geographic. Most combat is against the environment. Ironies abound, from the verbs the game has you performing to the way it interfaces with your button presses and analog sensitivities to how Norman Reedus will play with your own control of the camera in the private rooms, contrasting to how you play with Norman Reedus's body in the overworld. This preoccupation of playing with play comes out, very verbally, from the in-game character Heartman, who talks about the Homo Ludens concept so explicitly that I don't even need to make any stretchy connections between the book and the game when it comes to this guy. This Heartman flavor text, cross-referenced against the recent reading of the actual book, now has me interpreting Death Stranding as an homage to the hardiness of humanity's playfulness, as if play is our species' primary advantage when it comes to achieving accomplishments and surviving disasters. Through the game feel and game mechanics and flavor text, instead of through the dialogue cutscene scripts, Death Stranding is telling us that being a human being instead of a wild animal means thinking through problems as if they are like games. The game, Death Stranding, is about that thesis of the book, and reflecting on these very existential or even spiritual truths through absurdist or post-apocalyptic tragicomedy, like Waiting for Godot. This isn't very stretchy after reading these books. In fact, Death Stranding makes so much more sense now that the game doesn't even seem that weird to me anymore. It's a pretty conventional and reasoned commentary on unconventionality or weirdness. If you really want to play something weird, itch.io is right over there, but if you want to see a conventional AAA third-person action adventure nail the sensibilities of a weird indie game from itch.io, Death Stranding actually does it, and asks the very important question of, did the ape-like proto-humans who were gathering sticks in the forest a few million years ago ever just do it for fun? At what point in evolutionary history did the cognition to make work fun happen, or to even develop a distinction between their survival chores being for work or for fun? Now, what about making rope? What about peeling sticks down into fibers and knotting them together? That's a lot more complicated. Maybe about, who knows, 500,000 years ago, when the first primate person hominid guy who figured out how to make rope finally figured rope out, were they figuring it out for fun or for work? The literary works of Kobo Abe do not answer that question, but do provide a strong metaphorical background for basic human behaviors Kojima has been questioning and exploring throughout his whole career. Abe's influence is all over the place. Kobo Abe may even be responsible for planting the seeds that turned into the cardboard box. Kobo Abe may even be responsible for teaching Kojima how to compress time and space for effective fiction. Two of Abe's shorter stories, The Stick and The Rope, are given explicit acknowledgement in Death Stranding's title sequence. This shouldn't be too stretchy of a connection to make, but being able to find accessible versions of Abe texts in English is tough. There's a fan translation of Rope by Kojima expert Tim Rogers out there that he admits isn't his best translation work. With all due respect, the synopsis is not matching the text. There's another fan translation in Spanish by Anonymous, I guess, I couldn't find out, and the Spanish one has actually gotten more positive reception by the Spanish-speaking audience than the English one has. Listen, I can read a Pokemon game made for 6-year-olds in Spanish and do pretty okay. I can listen to the incredible Spanish dub of Metal Gear Solid and actually understand most of the script. But I gave La Soga a try and found out I can't actually read adult literature in Spanish yet. That's still beyond me. But my friend Jorge loved it, and we did a podcast about it, so if you can, I'd actually recommend starting with the Spanish translation over the current only English one we've got. Also, I'd actually recommend starting with Gloomy Monday Zeke's fan translation of The Stick first. I believe this one is more obviously connected to the streams of Death Stranding 1, and it's fun. By comparison, The Rope is a real rough read of a tearjerker. It is not fun, it might bum you out for the rest of the day, and the Death Stranding connections there require a bit more stretching, pun intended, so maybe save that one for later. Both stories are very Japanese works of social metaphors about taking individual sacrifices to maintain social harmony. The idea is that human nature is inherently dualistic, and that the tools and techniques humans invented over the eons can just as easily bring us together as they can tear us apart. And so, The Stick is a story that's humorous, lightweight, breezy, easy reading about a kind of utopian society. And The Rope is a rough, tough, tear-jerking, anger-inducing horror story about a dystopian society. First up, The Stick is about a well-meaning family man who's hanging out on one of those Japanese department store rooftop playgrounds with his kids. He accidentally slips off the roof and smacks into the ground below, but on his way down, he inexplicably turns into a stick. Why? How? It's not important. Remember, this is a video about interpreting surrealism, not literalism. The crowd on the street below is angry that this stick fell out of nowhere and almost killed someone. A security guard rushes upstairs to chastise the kids who he thinks threw it down. A kind of philosophy professor and his students who are hanging out nearby examines the stick and asks the students, "Hey guys, what if this stick used to be a man?" A philosophical dialogue ensues, where they're first shocked at the stick's potentially lethal power under the terminal velocity of the fall. It could have killed someone. It looks like a well-worn down tool that lived a useful life doing some kind of useful purpose before it turned into the dangerous hazard. The story ends with a return to the perspective of the stick man himself, who tragically remembers his poor kids who got left behind on that rooftop, but now accepts his newfound fate as an inanimate object tool to be used by others for either good or evil. A bit of dark humor, but also a kinda happy ending? Compare that to Rope, the tearjerker, a story about horrible parents raising horrible kids in a horrible place to horrible social consequence. I don't even want to spoil you with a synopsis. This one was easy to read but hard to visualize and similarly hard to talk about, but to give you the basic idea, there's a gang of kids growing up in the trash dump part of a town in a polluted industrial city, and they are getting their kicks, they are having their fun by abusing animals. There's two father figures nearby, a security guard who, like the security guard in Stick, could stop the kids and set a better example for them, but he ultimately does not. The actual father of a couple of these kids shows up, and we learn that the sociopathic behavior of these children was probably inherited from the previous generation. Because this father also does not chastise these kids, and instead ends up pathetically begging them for mercy, which doesn't work. The story ends on a downer. Unlike Stick, there's no magic, no surrealism, no one metamorphosizes into a social metaphor. The society depicted in Stick is productive and inquisitive and kind of optimistic. The society depicted in Rope is probably happening right now in many parts of the world. It is doomed, it is dying, it is covered in trash and pollution, and looking like one where everyone's gonna have a hard time for at least 2 more generations. These stories make Death Stranding make more sense by showing us how, despite all the Western acting cameos, the game is a very Japanese work of social metaphor about striking a balance between individual freedoms and social harmony. In a high-stakes setting where just one person's isolation, getting bad enough for them to die alone, will cause catastrophic consequences for everyone else. The duality of man is depicted by the opposite extremes of isolation versus interconnectedness. There's very little middle ground. On one end, Bridges is trying to rebuild society in a way that looks like an oppressive dystopian surveillance state. Making sure no one dies alone, apparently, means cameras everywhere except the shower. Handcuffs, medieval serfdom, highly secured walled cities of crowded, cramped apartments. Sam's real frustrated about it at first, but then comes around and says it cured his depression. On the other side, the villains, who seem like they just want to give up surviving the apocalypse, are nihilistic sociopaths whose grievances don't really strike me as a complicated or realistic human motivation, but do strike me as serving as representatives for those extreme human social metaphors. As a game about exploring connections in many forms, literal and metaphorical, the rope metaphors in this story are absolutely endless. From you roping together the communications and road networks that reconstruct society, to your BB's umbilical cord connecting long-buried memories back into the consciousness. This fiction's version of ghosts, the BTs, are tethered with a visible rope to the living world, just like Kojima's own artistic inspirations are tethered to all the external influences that come with a lifetime's worth of experiences. No man is an island, and art does not exist in a vacuum. This collection of essays by Kojima is a treasure trove of extremely specific citations of what ingredients went into his creative soup. It's a bunch of thoughts about what his favorite fictions have been throughout his life, what he was going through at the time, why they're his favorites. So, for example, the more hardcore Metal Gear fans like me have typically attributed the genesis of Metal Gear Solid with viewings of American action movies like Kurt Russell and Escape from New York. But in this book, we learn it really may have been from reading novels, and despite his reputation as a cinematic game developer, he really owes his storytelling talent to a lifetime of diligent reading and writing, instead of watching movies and playing games all day. For that matter, there's also a westernized assumption I'm gonna have to stop doing from here on out too. A lot of his source material never gained popularity in the English-speaking world. The Japanese novel Satori outlines his basic Metal Gear spy thriller plots: briefing, infiltration, torture, escape, betrayal, counterattack. Lucian Nahum's Shadow 81 novel was popular in Japan but relatively unknown in the US, and the synopsis Kojima provides sounds remarkably just like a Metal Gear Solid plot. He thinks Space Battleship Yamato reflects some kind of Japanese post-war guilt or anti-war sentiment where the authors will feel kind of weird about fetishizing how cool high-tech military hardware looks before getting all tragic about what happens when it's actually used. Which is, once again, very Metal Gear. For Death Stranding, the episodic romance stories set on the Hankyu train line in Hankyu Densha got him imagining individual people as little transit hubs of their own. Virus, the Day of Resurrection, had him thinking about how a human population of just 10,000 survivors might be able to fully recover all of humanity from a near-extinction event. Akira Yoshimura's Hyoru, or Castaway, is about a lonely shipwreck survivor on an abandoned island who goes insane from the loneliness and regresses to an animal-like mental state, until more shipwreck survivors show up and help him get his humanity back, and everyone works together to build an escape boat while leaving behind instructions for any future stranded sailors. The Summit of the Gods is a manga series about climbing Mount Everest, and it got Kojima into using mountain climbing as a metaphor for representing all of life's struggles. All of those examples are very Death Stranding. His essay about Hiroko Minagawa's Resurrection Fireplace include a reflection on a question that I noticed coming out from Homo Ludens. Kojima aches over how he achieved great fame 25 years ago by adding a meaningful message and exciting story to video games, only for most of today's video games to simply be more about killing time. This feels like a similar lesson learned from Homo Ludens, with how Death Stranding's gameplay makes hours of heroic adventurous gaming time by gamifying boring hard work, to hopefully give the player a moment of reflection about why they find this stuff fun. But the second half of the book digs way deeper than just listing and naming inspirations. There's about 3 essays towards the back half here that beautifully reflect on Kojima going through experiences of uncertainty and maturation in his older ages that his younger self couldn't have possibly been aware of. There is a rational explanation behind how and why he thinks he got his talent in the first place. His storytelling talent didn't come from magic, didn't come from genetics. It came from a lifetime of storytelling habits, beginning with his latchkey childhood, where he'd come home alone from school at like 4 years old with no parents in the house, and he'd either have to cry from loneliness or just imagine in his head what his family members would do and say if they were there.
Anybody home? Hello.
So for years, he was reading books all the time, and eventually got into writing unpublished novels in college that were probably way worse than what us fans got as his official big storytelling-heavy debut with Snatcher. By the time that was out, he had already written hundreds of pages of material for practice, and all that practice gradually paid off as the decades went on. It's a real contrast. The second half of this book is beautiful, and it feels like you're going from the heavily criticized bad writing of Kojima everyone complains about to the heavily applauded good Kojima, where so many fans speculate some kind of editor or translator being there to make the difference. The first half reads like so many of his shallow little magazine reviews, but the second half reads like what has been ubiquitously praised about Metal Gear Solid 1 and 3. Hell, for that matter, there's even a little joke at the end about how his writing isn't particularly great, and he seems to know, despite his storytelling abilities in video game form being unquestionably great. If you want to understand how good video game storytelling does not necessarily rely on just good writing alone, like so many other mediums do, combining this book with Homo Ludens will offer a thoroughly complete explanation of how playful activities can tell meaningful stories in nonverbal ways that don't rely on words alone. Does it make Death Stranding make more sense? Yes, absolutely, positively, 110% yes. Here's an example. In that final interview, Kojima compares playing Death Stranding with climbing Mount Fuji, and I was aghast and delighted to hear this confirmed. Back in 2019, I was one of the few reviewers who loved Death Stranding during its first few weeks after launch when it was going through that period of more divisive reception. And one of the reasons why may be because I climbed Mount Fuji too! As soon as I noticed my character tumbling down the slippery, ashy dust of a steep volcanic ascent, and how the control scheme is all about maintaining these uncomfortable hand poses for long periods of an endurance test, I was reminded of my real-life hiking and biking hobbies, and felt like I knew exactly what real-life activity Death Stranding was trying to gamify. This book is a testament to how important it is for human lives to have diverse and meaningful real-life experiences outside of games. Not just to design them well, but also to critique them well. And it's not just an explanation of all the stretchy connective rope metaphors all over Death Stranding, it is a demonstration of them, and how the experiences we go through as individuals gradually build onto each other to create new experiences for the greater collective, and how the cycle repeats from generation to generation. Last and yes least is this kind of bonus book I'm gonna throw in as a tragicomic irony. The Postman, by David Brin, is a 1985 post-apocalyptic sci-fi novel about a heroic delivery man who rebuilds the American government starting from the Postal Service up. He wanders between a handful of towns that are being terrorized by bandits and tells them that there still is a powerful administrative government hundreds of miles away who are planning on sending over the military to save them from the bandits and establish some basic services. And it's a great book. An exciting, easy breezy read with a lot of Kojima-isms to spot and a genuinely scary vision of a post-apocalyptic North America that hits especially hard right now. There's that tension between individualism versus collectivism, with hyper-masculine, rugged individualists depicted as the bad guy bandits who serve as a reminder that the assholes of today still existed in the 1980s. In the book, the bandits are Andrew Tate types. They're toxic masculinists who believe that their abusive might makes right by logic of sexual strength differences. In the hilarious Kevin Costner 1997 movie version, the villains are explicitly racist neo-Confederates who are raising a slave army by kidnapping minorities from the towns they're terrorizing. In both the book and the movie, the Postman character appeals to some kind of sense of nostalgic American patriotism to get the terrorized peasants interested in building a government that will protect the weak. In the book, the final climax is especially like Metal Gear Solid 1, ending with genetically augmented shirtless super soldiers wrestling each other in a symbolic conflict over genetic determinism and even sexual determinism. It's great. The book is great. The movie is great. Oh, the movie is awful. It is so good. They actually build a giant statue of Kevin Costner, who actually saves America with his acting skills. It is so bad, it is a blast. At least it is nowadays. Apparently, if you watched it back in the 90s, it wasn't as much fun. Anyways, the author's own reaction to spotting these similarities is where I think some delightful ironies come into play. David Brin, the author, alleged that Kojima blatantly plagiarized his ideas for the game, but I'm with the fan consensus on this one. The premises are similar, sure, but really only skin deep, and Death Stranding really is its own unique piece of art in a completely different medium from a very different perspective, telling a 95% different story. Legally speaking, I'm confident it's not plagiarism. Casually speaking, I still don't think so. I mean, the sci-fi apocalypse in the Postman is pretty low-tech. They don't have super advanced robot technology everywhere, and Kevin Costner's not carrying a baby. Anyways, I think the real tragedy is that he seems to have stopped writing blogs after this controversy. Despite the controversy, it is a great book, and he is a great author, and I hate sharing the same opinion with a fan base so visceral and toxic that it might have been harassment over this matter that had him stop. I don't think it's reasonable at all to demand a 75-year-old man to play all the way through a modern 3D video game with complicated controls and a 40-hour playtime that requires a completely different frame of reference to appreciate the satire. What's funny is that the Postman existing, and the author noticing the inspiration, does make a good conclusion for the ideas tossed around by this reading list, and the lessons the game is trying to teach players. Kojima's games are all about spreading new cultural ideas after digesting a unique combination of previous ones. In that context, the Postman does ironically help make Death Stranding make more sense. It does help to imagine Kojima watching this stupid movie 30 years ago, or reading this smart, awesome book 40 years ago, and only barely remembering it at all while subconsciously soaking up and spitting out something superficially similar. Across so much time, the memories of every single inspiration would not have been clear during the creative process. So, speaking of books that make games make more sense, what about a book about a game that's about writing about books about games that now has a book about that game? This video is brought to you by Lost in Cult, who make premium, artistically inspired bookish box sets for those who appreciate video games as a form of art. They're well known for their high-end, premium, deep-dive books on Outer Wilds, Valhalla, Animal Well, and now they're tackling the Alan Wake series. The Alan Wake Design Works book is more than just an art book. Made in collaboration with Remedy Entertainment, this is a 250-plus page deep dive into the whole series, including new development stories with new insights and new concept art, pulling information straight from the source, with extensive developer interviews with key figures like Sam Lake, Mikhail Kasarinen, and many, many more, piecing together the development story of Alan Wake one lovingly illustrated page at a time. The book is even interactive, with hidden concept art obscured by thermoreactive ink. As always with the Design Works books, there's a very special deluxe edition available exclusively during the pre-order campaign ending October 17th. The deluxe edition comes inside a fold-backed clamshell presentation box, with the hardcover book inside a dust jacket based on the in-game return manuscript. A trove of extras includes cards, maps, posters, Polaroids, many of this stuff signed by the developers, along with the real-life physical print version of the in-game return manuscript. If you're watching this after October 17th, or just want to buy the book by itself, the standard edition will remain available, but be quick for the deluxe edition. Once again, this video is brought to you by Lost in Cult, so if this looks up your alley, please show your support and help the channel in return by using the code SUPERBUNNYHOPAW at lostincult.uk, or use the link in the description below, to get 5% off this new Alan Wake physical collection, or anything from their store right now.